You know, it's funny, isn't it? We talk about these big political events, these debates that are supposed to shape the nation, and yet so often the vice presidential ones, they kind of get brushed aside, like they're the B-side to the main event.
Right, you almost forget they happen sometimes.
Exactly. But this year felt different. The Vance-Walz debate. That wasn't just two guys on a stage. That felt like watching two completely different visions for America going head to head.
It really did, and I think that's why so many people were glued to their screens for this one, because it wasn't just about policy, was it? It was almost symbolic. On the one hand, you had Vance, this political firebrand, right? Stamped with the Trump seal of approval. And on the other side, you had Walz. Years of experience as a governor, that steady hand that people associate with, well, the Harris way of doing things. And the article we're looking at today, When Policy Meets Populism, I mean, talk about a title that nails it.
Right. Gets to the heart of the matter. And it's interesting because the article doesn't just stay surface level. You know, it digs into specific moments that highlight this clash, like right out the gate, immigration. Huge topic, obviously. And Vance came out swinging using that very loaded phrase, open border, and even talking about its impact on specific communities like Springfield, Ohio.
And that's such a deliberate tactic, isn't it? Because it takes this big abstract issue, immigration, and makes it feel real. Relatable. Suddenly, it's not just about statistics, it's about your neighbor, your community. You put a face on it, and it becomes so much more powerful.
And then there's Walz's response, which was fascinating. Because he didn't just refute the points, he went somewhere else entirely. He brought in this moral dimension, even quoting Matthew 25.4u about welcoming the stranger. Suddenly, we're not just talking policy, we're talking about our ethical obligations as human beings.
It's like they were speaking two different languages on the same stage.
Totally. And that contrast played out again when they got to the economy, didn't it?
Yeah.
Vance was all about those Trump-era tax cuts, painting this picture of unprecedented prosperity for the American worker. Very make America great again, but with a nostalgia trip thrown in.
Exactly. It's that yearning for a simpler time, a time when made in America had this different connotation, right? And whether or not the economic realities actually match up with that rosy picture, well, that's another debate entirely. But the narrative itself is powerful, especially for voters who feel like the system has failed them, who feel left behind.
And then you have Walz on the other side of that coin saying, hold on a second, even before the pandemic, manufacturing was down, things weren't all peachy for a lot of folks. He even called it a manufacturing recession at one point.
Which just goes to show you the same data points can be spun in completely opposite directions. It's enough to make your head spin, right?
Seriously. It makes you wonder, how's anyone supposed to cut through all the noise? How can listeners, everyday people, make sense of these economic claims, regardless of who's making them?
It's the million-dollar question these days, isn't it? Because we're bombarded with information from every direction. My advice, don't just take it at face value. Look beyond the headlines. Ask yourself, who benefits from me believing this? What's the agenda here? Even a little healthy skepticism can go a long way. Now, moving on from the economy, because things got really heated when they got to social issues, especially abortion.
Oh, yeah, that was a tense one. Vance seemed perfectly content to just kick that can down the road to the states, avoiding a clear stance on a federal ban.
Smart move, strategically speaking, especially in a national election. You don't want to alienate voters on either extreme, right? But Walz, he went a different route. Got very personal, sharing stories of women directly affected by those restrictive abortion laws. And it really underlined this fundamental question. Can you even have a productive debate on something like abortion when the two sides are coming from such radically different places, values-wise?
It's like trying to have a conversation about colors when one person can see the full spectrum and the other one's seeing in black and white.
That's a great analogy. And it actually brings us to another fascinating moment. I don't know about you, but that curveball right out of the gate, that question about potentially launching airstrikes on Iran, that caught me off guard.
Oh, I was on the edge of my seat.
Yeah?
No idea where they were going with that one. What'd you make of their responses?
Brilliant move by the moderators, forcing them to address America's role in the world right off the bat. Vance, as you might expect, channeled that America First energy, very reminiscent of Trump, hinted at a more, shall we say, proactive approach.
While Walz was, as you'd expect, leaning more on diplomacy and building alliances, slower to pull the trigger, but not backing down either.
Exactly. And it really highlights that fundamental tension in American foreign policy, doesn't it? This idea of, do we lead with military might or strategic partnerships, which is more effective, especially in the long run? Feels like that debate's been going on forever.
It's the question, isn't it? And speaking of questions that never seem to go away, did you get the feeling that the 2020 election was like this elephant in the room the whole time?
Oh, absolutely. The article even points out how the aftermath of 2020 has cast this long shadow over everything. And nowhere was that clearer than when Vance dodged that question about the legitimacy of the election results.
I thought they were going to cut his mic off. He was dancing around it so much.
Right. And that's something I want to unpack a bit further if we have time. Because it's not just about one election anymore, is it?
It's about the whole darn system. Let's dig in.
It's like, that moment when he hesitated. When Vance hesitated on whether or not the 2020 election was actually legitimate, I don't know, it felt like this really, really big deal.
Like a defining moment, almost.
Exactly. It's bigger than him. You know what I mean? It's like this underlying current that's running through, everything. It's about trust, or I guess the lack of it. Trust in our democracy, trust in the system.
And without that trust, where do we even go from here? How do you even begin to have a conversation about solutions, about the future of the country when...
It's like trying to, I don't know, build a house on a foundation that's just crumbling underneath you. You can't move forward if you don't even agree on the basic facts.
It's true. And it feels like social media just throws gasoline on that fire, doesn't it? After every debate, every political event these days, everyone just retreats to their own little corners of the internet. And
it's all just an echo chamber at that point, right? Like the algorithms, they know what we want to hear, what will keep us clicking. And so we just end up in these filter bubbles surrounded by people who already agree with us.
It's like we're losing the ability to even listen to each other, let alone have a productive conversation. And those conversations, as tough as they can be, they're the lifeblood of a democracy, aren't they?
They really are. They're where we challenge our own assumptions, where we learn and grow. And without that willingness to engage with different perspectives,
we're in trouble.
Speaking of different perspectives, there was another moment in the debate that I wanted to circle back to, something Vance said that really caught my attention. It was when he was talking about the rising cost of housing, and he kind of just threw it out there, almost casually, that immigrants were to blame.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. Classic scapegoating, wasn't it? It's this really, really effective, but also really insidious way of tapping into people's anxieties,
Yeah.
Because those anxieties are real.
Yeah.
People are struggling. They're worried about making ends meet, about putting a roof over their heads. But to just point the finger at immigrants.
It's so much easier than actually tackling the complex systemic issues, right? The ones that don't have easy answers, the ones that require us to, actually think critically and challenge the status quo.
Because sound bites, as catchy as they are, they rarely tell the whole story. And it's that whole story, that nuanced, messy, complicated story that we need to grapple with if we want to make any real progress.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what I appreciate about what we're trying to do here on the Deep Dive, It's not about telling people what to think. It's about giving them the tools
to think for themselves, right? And to be more discerning about the information they're consuming, to ask the tough questions.
Exactly. And it's not just about politics either. It's about everything. It's about being an engaged citizen in the broadest sense. Now, I know we've been talking a lot about the negative stuff, the erosion of trust, the filter bubbles, but I'm curious, do you have any hope that we can fix this?
I do. I have to. Because the alternative, it's just, it's unthinkable. But it's going to take work. Conscious effort. Like you said earlier, we need to start by acknowledging the problem, by being honest about the challenges we're facing as a society. And then we need to start talking to each other, really talking, listening with the intent to understand, not just to respond.
That's so important. It's like, we're going to disagree. That's inevitable. But can we disagree respectfully? Can we try to see the world through each other's eyes, even just for a moment?
And maybe, just maybe, through that process of listening and understanding, we can start to find some common ground.
I love that. Common ground. It's not about erasing our differences, right? It's about figuring out how to move forward together despite them.
And that feels like a good place to leave it for now. More to come after a quick break. It's like, you watch these debates and it's easy to get caught up in the whole horse race aspect of it all. Who scored the most points? Who had the best singer? But, zoom out for a second. We're really talking about some big questions here about the direction of America.
You hit the nail on the head. And this debate, Vance and Walz, it really brought some of those fundamental tensions into stark relief. I mean, we talked about their stances on the economy, immigration, foreign policy, all crucial stuff, but it was almost like those issues were just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. Like, what's the deeper story those disagreements are telling us?
Right. Underneath it all, it was about values, about identity, about, like, what does it mean to be an American in the 21st century? And frankly, how do we deal with the fact that not everyone agrees on the answer anymore?
And how much of that disconnect is driven by fear? Because I don't know about you, but I could practically feel this undercurrent of anxiety running through that whole debate.
Oh, 100%. And we've seen it time and time again throughout history, haven't we? When people are afraid, uncertain about the future, it creates this fertile ground for certain types of rhetoric.
The kind that offers easy answers. Scapegoats. Someone to blame.
Exactly. It's tempting, right? Because who wants to grapple with complex systemic problems when someone's offering you a simple solution?
But those simple solutions rarely hold up, do they? Not in the long run.
And that's where we as individuals, as citizens, have to be really vigilant. We can't just outsource our critical thinking to politicians or pundits. We've got to be willing to do the work ourselves.
Which is tough, because, let's be honest, it's overwhelming out there. Information overload 24/7. How do we even begin to be more discerning about what we consume, especially when it comes to something as important as politics?
It's a process, that's for sure. It starts with self-awareness, I think. What are my biases? Where do I get my news? Am I getting the full picture, or am I stuck in an echo chamber?
Because it's so easy to get stuck in those echo chambers these days.
Yeah.
So once we've got a handle on our own biases, then what?
Then it's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives. Don't just read headlines. Actually click on the article, check the sources. If something makes you angry, ask yourself why. Is it well-reasoned anger? Or is it because it's hitting some kind of emotional button?
We got to be our own fact checkers in a way.
Absolutely. And it's not just about being skeptical of information we disagree with either. We've got to apply that same critical lens to stuff that already aligns with our worldview.
Oh, that's hard.
But it's so important.
It is. But ultimately, I think it comes down to remembering our shared humanity.
Right.
We could disagree vehemently on policy, on strategy, on the best path forward. But we could still acknowledge the other person's humanity, their right to hold different beliefs. It's that willingness to engage in good faith, especially when it's hard. Because that's how progress happens, right? Not through shouting matches or silencing dissent, but through respectful dialogue.
Girl.
Even if we never fully agree.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, that feels like a good place to wrap up today's deep dive.
It does. As always, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. To our listeners out there, keep those conversations going. Talk to your family, your friends, that coworker who always has a different take on things. Engage with those tough questions. And above all, stay curious.
Because the more we understand about the world around us, the better equipped we'll be to navigate its complexities. And who knows, we might even make it a little bit better along the way.
Hear, hear. Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.